Distance connections. Do you have a way to make it go away?
I did. Oops.
Yeah, I think it can turn out. So
Wait a minute. Let's see if this is it. Yeah.
yeah, there's a little somewhere in here for it that if it gets fit by mistake, it would set the bonus to it. The little fire. Yeah.
This one already put that.
Okay, that's it now.
So I'm going to get rid of this one. Get rid of that one. Just hit that one. Which one?
Next to the PowerPoint, yeah.
That, there you go.
Okay, they're there. That's good.
There's two people there
And
anyway.
there's only two people who we normally expect, so that's great. Okay, so then if you click the little orange arrow, there it will go onto the side and get away. And then, except we want to get rid of you can minimize the screen.
Well, you can, when you pull up PowerPoint, that'll
It's interesting to see when I did that. That's what happened. I didn't realize this.
yeah, when you pull up the PowerPoint.
So I'll just keep it there.
Okay. Yeah, that'd be great. And then we can make sure it doesn't show over your, I think the bar will show when you do your PowerPoint. Yeah, is that, well, we don't,
Yeah.
yeah, but we don't really need.
Unless you want to see yourself.
That's okay. And so that, yeah.
That did not do everything.
Okay. That's okay. Okay, you good to go? Good morning. Sorry to be a little late getting started. Thanks for being here in a timely fashion. So our speaker this week again is Penny Jester, and she's going to talk today about vulnerable populations and possible issues of consent, and look forward to an interesting discussion.
Thank you all. So you'll notice your handouts are really dense. And I decided, I was trying to figure out what do you put in a PowerPoint when you're talking about ethics. And I thought, I really just need you all to discuss it, because truly, anything involved with vulnerable populations is really focused on the ethical conduct of research with human subjects. And those human subjects that may require a little bit more attention. I really just have, it's one presentation, and we'll stop midway, because it was hard to pull out consent and from other issues related to vulnerable populations, because I think they're all intermixed. If you all were to just identify, and I know you've got them in your hands, but try not to look at the PowerPoint, who are vulnerable populations? Who would you say is a vulnerable population? Children? That's a big one.
Unconscious people.
Yes, exactly. Pregnant women. Pregnant women. Inmates. Inmates, absolutely. Yeah, really. Mm-hmm. So we've got, and so pregnant women, I'll repeat those in case they weren't heard remotely. Pregnant women, children, prisoners, and I'm going to forget something, the unconscious, patients who are in the hospital who can't consent, or patients who come into the emergency department with head trauma and need to be in a research study. You know, they're a vulnerable population. The elderly.
Anybody who really can't speak fully for themselves.
That's right. The cognitively impaired, the people who are, and the economically impaired. Think about that. You think about I can't tell you how many research studies I've been aware of that have what we call repeat offenders or repeat participators, because they're people looking for money. You know, they're maybe not high-risk studies, but they participate in research. So one could argue that they're a vulnerable population because they're putting themselves at risk, and is there anything, then we as researchers have to think about, what can we do to minimize the risk? That's the whole point of what we want to focus on with vulnerable populations. A lot of what we talk about here will be related to IRBs, and that's because the IRB is sort of the gatekeeper. They're the people, when you write a study, they're the people you go to say, okay, I'm going to use a vulnerable population. Their question to you is, okay, how are you going to protect them? What protections do you have written into your protocol, written into your consent that will protect them more than the well-educated, conscious, mostly healthy, human being? So again, as we go through this, you will note a lot of references to the IRB. A lot of times there are no clear-cut answers. When you look at the regulations, as always, regulations can be interpreted. And a lot of times, regulations and the IRB can't put in writing every single way to address an ethical issue. They just can't, because it's not black and white. You've got your population, you've got your study design. It takes your input when you write a protocol and when you do a study, as well as letting the IRB know how you're doing it. They're sort of the folks who can say, yeah, I think you've got it right, you've got enough protections put into your protocol and your consent. But again, there really are not always black and white answers here. But I think the most important thing to get out of this presentation is knowing what the vulnerable populations are and knowing how to think through it, how to identify what the issues might be. So our objectives today were to define what and who is a vulnerable population, to describe how to deal with the populations, and identify issues in consenting for those populations. So here are some of the, again, for purposes of reference, Over here we have the regulations that might apply to the different groups we identified. And again, when you think about prisoners, think about people else, anybody who's confined, any institutionalized patient, that kind of. So we don't address the people in the ER. We don't address directly the people in the ICU who may be in a comatose state. But the regulations, again, can be interpreted to address those needs as well. So the main issues. Here are some. The main issues with vulnerable populations that we have to think about is their ability to comprehend the consent in the study. Think about the people who might be, economically impaired. They don't care to understand the protocol, they just want the money. So what are you going to do to help them understand the protocol, even though that's not the top of their priority list? Prisoners, depending on what you're offering, and they may feel coerced to be in the study, so how do you make sure they understand and clearly and freely volunteer to be in the study? We'll come back to all of these as we go through the presentation. Increased risk. You do have an increased risk, particularly with neonates, particularly with pregnant women, with children. Because those are a lot of really unknown populations. Those are the populations that we have not studied well in the past. So for that reason, it adds to their increased risk for being in studies. Ability to freely consent. You're a prisoner, and someone approaches you about participating in a study, and your warden is standing there. I don't know how the structure works in the prison, but you want to always be in good favor with whoever is confining you to be in jail. So might you participate just to make your warden look good? I don't know. But again, things you have to think about when you're providing consent. Can children freely consent? I have to tell you, I did a presentation in the UK a few years ago on the consenting of children. And there was a woman there from the UK who simply said, children should be the only ones who are allowed to consent themselves. Parents should have no impact. And she was really pushing that agenda, which is interesting because that's not how we generally approach it. And I think even in the UK right now, they do expect parent participation. But it's a thought, should children be allowed to fully consent for themselves? And that's certainly a major issue to debate. Easily coerced and manipulated. The mentally impaired, children, it's truly a major issue with some of our population. Yes, sir.
One thing I can ask this, I frequently survey my students. So the IRB is very sensitive to issues around, do my students feel, coerced and manipulated to participate?
That's a really good one, Andrew. I think that's, when you're a teacher, when you're in any position of authority, and even when you're a physician and you're also a researcher, your patient is more likely to participate in the study because they feel, oh, my doctor says it's offering this, and it must be a good thing. So, again, all I can say is, we're not going to have clear-cut answers here today, but I need you to be thinking about these things and be aware of them. There are a lot of regulations out there. Certainly, there's the Code for Federal Regulations, which is under the FDA, and OHARP is the group that oversees IRBs. There's lots of regulations that they've written. And you can spend hours reading them and equal number of hours not understanding them because of the way they're written. But they are there. Again, this is simply identification of where you can find some of the regulations. Just because this is often a gray area, you will hear about the common rule. And what this is it's a composite of codes and a composite of requirements that are written into, they're prepared by the Department of Health and Human Services that provide guidance on how to protect human subjects. That's really all they are, but they call it the common rule. And when you go through research and you go to presentations, especially ethical ones, you'll just hear that statement. Again, they provide protections, and we'll talk about some of these as we go through. So again, the whole intent is to have policies in place to protect people who participate in research. OHRP, again, is our IRB oversight group. Again, they direct and oversee the IRBs, and the IRBs have the authority to oversee research at the local site. You all know that. But in overseeing the research, they have to, they clearly are your backup to understanding how to deal with vulnerable populations. When one of the very specifics in the IRB membership is it does discuss that the IRBs will review research involving vulnerable subjects and will be required to have members on their committee who can really represent those vulnerable populations well. Prisoners, they'll have a prisoner on there. I don't know if they have teachers on there when they review education efforts, but they might. I mean, again, I'm not fully aware of all the folks that they bring on. I know they have obstetricians. I know that they have pediatricians. I know they'll have folks who do genetics research will be sitting on the committee when those topics are reviewed. I don't think there are too many unconscious members. But they do have, they're heavy in having a few really, they have an ICU clinician. They would provide, the adequate review. So among the group, vulnerable populations, and this to me sometimes, this is almost the most complicated because I'm not an obstetrician, and a lot of this is, I understand it, but not in depth. But certainly fetuses and humans in vitro, in human in vitro fertilization is clearly a vulnerable area. Fetuses, they're unique. They have a unique relationship with their mother. Can a mother consent to be in a study for her unborn child? And this, regulations are very sensitive about this. The IRBs are very sensitive. And there's been a lot of debate. Boards have been designed to oversee this and figure out how to best deal with fetus in research. And mostly because they might be an indirect subject. If the mother's under a pregnant woman is doing research, that fetus is involved in the research, or very well could be. So, and again, what happened in 1974, there was actually a commission put together to look into this issue, to look at it closely. And they decided that they couldn't really decide a fetus's personhood, but they decided it was important to respect that fetus as a human being. So they didn't want to negate or minimize the importance of that unborn child. What they have said, though, that they do require, let me step back, two things you have, which is your handout, then a list of definitions. Again, you will have that for reference later on if you want it now, but the word minimal risk, again, we'll come to that later, but that's really, there's less than minimal risk, there's greater than minimal risk or greater, and those are really the two basic risk categories that we look at. Less than minimal risk is when a subject is being exposed to something they would if they were walking down the street. Or if you go to, yes, sir?
Yes, so when you're writing an IRB, and you're not expecting to have any vulnerable population, do you still have to include something in there about how to handle it? And then if you don't, the second part of it is, what do you need to write an entire new IRB if you happen to identify a new patient population that is in the vulnerable group, or is it an addendum to the existing? Or?
If you decide to, so the IRB will ask you who your population is. They will ask, they'll identify, are there women in it? They'll ask you to identify, are there women in it? Are there children in it? Prisoners. I'm not sure the categories and what they actually have in the application. If you check no, you can't enroll any of those people. You cannot enroll unless you amend your protocol.
You can amend it, but you don't have to write a new one. Okay.
Well, you might. It kind of depends on the nature of the research, too. Because you might have to include, again, would it be a new one? I think that's up to you. If you want to modify your protocol to expand the population you want to enroll, then you would amend it. Now, it'll probably go back for full review. If somehow you can add, a child and you realize there's not additional risk, it might not have to go back for full review. But I think chances are if you're adding a vulnerable population, yes, you can amend it, but it would require another review. But that doesn't, it's just time.
Right.
So they won't demand, again, it's up to you. And you have to think about the integrity of your study. Are you, if you're deep into the study and then you're going to include a whole new population, your data is still going to be acceptable. But that's a call you have.
So that you would not put vulnerable population patients into an IRB when you do not actually have any patients, but you anticipate that maybe along the line you'll get them, just to have it in there?
If you anticipate, then I would check that you're going to include them, because you're going to be screening them possibly. You don't think that they'll be involved, but you would want to get it taken care of up front.
Actually, next week, the class is led by Carrie Oliver, who's in the IRB, and so some of the details of some of these things we're cooking up
Yes.
tomorrow.
IRB considerations, again, they're going to look at your protocol if you're using fetuses or in vitro, you're going to study human in vitro fertilization. What they will require is that you have animal subjects before you go into humans. They want to know that you've at least tested this the best you can before you begin the study with human or in this vulnerable population. I also would like you to do it especially if it's an interventional study. They certainly want the drug tested in non-pregnant people, so you have a good baseline, so you have a good safety profile of whatever you're doing. They will require that. The investigator may have no part in the decision. Oh, this is a critical one, and in the state of Alabama, it's probably less of an issue than other places because we are pretty restrictive on abortions. And if you're doing a study on aborted fetuses or women who might have abortions, you cannot approach them until after they have the abortion. Because if you approach them before they have the abortion, you might unduly influence them to have the abortion. So again, that's a small thing, but if you think about it, it's a big thing in the nature of the research. A lot of discussion has gone on at the higher levels about how to deal with these types of studies. When research is directed toward the fetus in utero, it can involve the fetus directly or just indirectly through the mother, or both ways, of course. So it's just, again, carefully, you want to make sure you meet the health needs of the fetus and that it's conducted in a way to minimize risk if at all possible. If the research poses no more than minimal risk, again, no more than minimal risk means that it's the balance of risk and benefit is pretty equitable. The development of, again, it can be done if it's, again, at this level. It will require, though, you want to have very strong scientific justification for these populations, especially this one. Fetal, again, continuing on with that same line. Just a background, so there was a moratorium that you may have known in 1988 where we could no longer do fetal tissue transplant research. Panel met, and now the moratorium has been lifted because they've come up with guidance on how to study fetal tissue ethically. Again, this goes back to what I said earlier. If you're using aborted tissue, you cannot, the investigator cannot influence the mother when she is determining to do the abortion, if that happens. So again, the timing and method of abortion could not be influenced by the potential use of fetal tissue. Also, interesting, no payments are allowed, which is the only regulation on the books where you're not allowed to pay subjects. But if it's an aborted tissue, you cannot pay the mother for that. I think it just adds a little color to the ethics. Informed consent issues, again, I've already mentioned that you cannot consent. The decision to consent and consent must take place after the child has been aborted. Again, critical things prohibiting direct donations. People can't voluntarily come to you. This is very much a gray area for me. I will tell you. This is, again, it's the regulation, but experimenting with transplants with fetal tissue from induced abortions. Again, you can't have outsiders involved. And keeping the mother keeping it anonymous for others is really critical, because this is a very sensitive area. Again, as I said before, sufficient evidence from animal experimentation is needed to justify proceeding to human clinical trials. And in addition, federal requirements, many states have adopted legislation governing the use of fetal tissue, including use for transplant purposes. I think the other thing to keep in mind as you look at vulnerable populations, you've got federal laws to look at, state laws and local laws, and institution laws or requirements. So you have to know all of them, because clearly what might be accepted nationally might not be accepted in the state. And as always with research, you have to go for the most restrictive. You have to adhere to the most restrictive requirement. You cannot say, well, I like the federal law because it's more liberal. That doesn't work if you're in the state of Alabama where there's a more restrictive law. Again, you always have to go to the more restrictive. So research on the anticipation of abortion. Again, we've sort of talked about this. It could be important. I mean, it is important. There's some benefit to, if you think about it, the opportunity to test drugs or procedures on fetuses whose mothers have already made a decision to abort poses little risk to the fetus that's going to be aborted. One could argue that. Problem is, it's still coercive. I mean, it still could, it could be perceived as coercive. And risky, because what if the mother changes her mind? What if she says, I'm going to abort, I'll be in that study, it won't matter. So we give her the drug that's toxic to the fetus, and then she changes her mind. You can't take that risk. It puts people in too much jeopardy. The consent, this is where, even with children, we get into a touchy subject. Parents, our fathers and mothers. There are usually two people involved in the baby being conceived. And is it the mother who should only have the right to say what happens to that fetus? And truthfully, not really. There's concern that the father should have, by law, the father should have some say. He certainly is the father. He brought that baby into the world, so he should. This is his child. He's legally responsible for the health of that child. So if the mother, I mean, by law, that's the way it's usually written. You are legally responsible. And if the mother goes through some research that affects the baby, causes a birth defect, then the dad is stuck. I mean, one could argue he could be stuck paying more bills and having to deal with that. And if the parents aren't agreeing, it can be quite disruptive to the family. And, as a researcher, you don't want to do that. You don't want to stir up the pot if you can help it. So having the father agree is real important. Now, can that always happen, and should it always happen? Maybe not. First of all, exceptions for the requirement of the father's consent, the father's identity or whereabouts cannot be found. That makes sense. He's not available. It's a result of rape. Otherwise, there's really no other reason when the father should not be part of the consent process. The IRB, again, they're your best source, and they will guide you through this after they review the protocol and have a whole board discuss it. The IRB will provide guidance to the investigator to assist in determining when the father is reasonably available. Again, it can be these are additional items that may come into play. Paternity is uncertain, father's whereabouts can't be ascertained. The father does not acknowledge that he's the father. No responsibility for, the father has a responsibility. A touchy subject, but you really do have to address it because it will come back in the end to get you if you do enroll another without consulting the father and he wants to be involved. Again, the word reasonably available depends on the IRB. That's what they're there for. They will help make those decisions. And just kind of aside, and this is sort of, but I think it's about vulnerable populations. I was contacted by an investigator doing a phase 1 study, new drug, first time in humans, and it's a really great center for brain cancer. It is posted on clinicaltrials.gov, if you all know what that is. So it's seen nationally, even though it's only being done here at UAB. Well, somebody from Minnesota wants to participate in the study. The ethical issue there is these are very vulnerable populations. If you think about it, if I have a family member who has a tumor, there's no other, that he's failed all the other treatments for, and he has the opportunity, he or she has the opportunity to participate in a novel new drug, one-time infusion, and then we just follow the subject, and it's shown it's great results in humans. So this family in Minnesota, they'll pay anything. The coordinator spoke to them, and she said, you'll have to come and stay for 5 days for the infusion, and then you'll need to come back every 2 weeks, and then every 4 weeks, and every 6 weeks, and we'll follow you for a year. It's a lot. This family's desperate. They're vulnerable. They said, we'll pay anything. We'll come. Problem is, will they? And it's not for fault of their own. If you think about it, we should say yes. We should, if they've committed to coming. But once they get the infusion, there's nothing to do that unless they're having problems. They're going to be so far away that if they call with a serious adverse event, we're not going to be able to assess them because we can't get to them. So the investigator was quite torn as to whether to, he didn't want to say no to the subject, but it was almost like the subject cannot be providing adequate data to evaluate the drug. So we took it to the IRB, and it was very interesting. I called the IRB, and they said, what we will do, if you send us an amendment, we will discuss it at the board and help the investigator determine if they should or should not enroll that subject. So there certainly was nothing in the protocol that said you had to live within 500 miles. But this, again, the IRB was going to jump in and help the investigator determine the best course of action for that subject. So again, I know I got off track here a little bit, but I just want to reemphasize that the IRB is really going to be able to help you.
So what was the outcome?
I'm still waiting. I'll try and get back with you. I don't know. I know that the investigator's been asked to submit something to the IRB. So, but yeah, you're on me. In a week or so, because we should know. Again, continuing on with in vitro fertilization. Another way to look at the ethics and the vulnerability of subjects and how to address those issues is there are many organizations. For example, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists have put together an ethics board that as an investigator, if you're doing a study on, say, in vitro fertilization or anything related to OB/GYN, you could contact this board and help them think through the ethical aspects of your research study. That is what they're there for, to help provide guidelines and to provide some guidance. And IRBs will contact them. But you as an investigator can do the same. So research involving fetuses, from in vitro to, to any time before they're born. These are basically the main questions that you need to be asking yourself when you're putting together a protocol, when you're writing your consent form. Has animal research, these are, again, topics that we've discussed, but has animal research been done? Is it appropriate and feasible that non-pregnant women possibly have already been studied? Is there a risk to the fetus? What is it? How important is it? How great is it? Can you get the information any other way? Is it a minimal risk? Is the research non-viable fetuses in ex utero? Is there any intervention proposed that would shorten or prolong the natural course of life? Again, that's a question that you're asking if you're looking at the non-viable fetuses. Are the investigators involved in any decisions about abortion? I've talked about that. You sure don't want to be far away from that decision as you can. Again, not encouraging research for any purposes, and who must be consented to the purposes of this. So then we just get to pregnant women in research. Why are they unique? Women who are pregnant are unique for probably all the reasons y'all can think of. Women have additional health concerns, and other concerns than men do because they do get pregnant. And certain things happen to the female body when she's pregnant, so that's important. But whatever research or whatever she participates in, there has to be, she doesn't want to increase the risk of the fetus. And as we've said before, there's a third party who may be affected but cannot really give consent. So if you think about it, you've got the husband giving consent, the wife giving consent, the baby doesn't. And so that's, again, makes that child, certainly, as we've mentioned, population, and the mother. Again, I'm sort of repeating this, but it is very important. The DHHS requires the father be informed, except in certain situations. And again, these are kind of the same ones we've reviewed. The one we didn't talk about earlier, the purpose of research, is to meet the health needs of the mother. If it's strictly the health needs of the mother and it's determined there's a way that it's going to affect the fetus, but she's a pregnant woman, then the father doesn't need to be involved in the consent. It's only when it may involve the child. Yes, sir?
In a case where the father is the biological father, the consent comes from which father?
It would be it's a very good question. It's a very good question. I wish you hadn't asked it because I don't know the answer. Well, what do you all think? I mean, I don't. It's so clearly it's not in the regulations. If it's not a biological father. Now it's true. Nothing says none of the regs say biological father that I'm aware of. But it might. But how would it be? You did in vitro fertilization?
Sperm donor.
Biological. Yeah, sperm donor.
Oh, I mean,
That's
you argue
interesting.
it on the basis of legal responsibility, so I'd
But
imagine
he
it's
still is.
that
Yeah.
father who's legally responsible. But
Mhm.
is that any consideration?
I would okay. Ethically, I would say yes. But what do you all think? I mean, I think that if let's say it's a sperm donor and used, it seems if they did it jointly, then that is the father, the legally responsible party. Anybody have another thing? That would be challenging. You have to check with the IRB next week. Ask them if they want to pass it. IRB considerations, again, we're repeating some themes, participation of pregnant women in research. Is it directed toward the mother's health or toward the fetuses? And is the risk to the woman and to the fetus or infant? So is it just one or the other? But we've already kind of talked about the fetuses. Again, everything is subject to federal law. The purpose of the activity must be to meet the needs of the mother, and the fetus will be placed at risk only to a minimum extent, then it's okay. Or the risk to the fetus is minimal. But again, we're reiterating some themes from the use of fetuses research. One of the things that has occurred in NIH particularly is if any of you do any grants or contracts or any submissions, R01s, whatever, you will always be asked, are you including are you including minorities, women, et cetera, in your study? You have to have good justification for including them, and you have to have a good justification for them. Again, it's dependent on the study itself. There is nothing, it does not, this goes for every single protocol. There's nothing you can do. You can do a natural history study, and they still want to know if you're including all these populations. Again, it isn't one, there's not really one right or wrong answer. It's what's right for your protocol, and you just good justification. So, again, giving mothers enough information when they are when they are of childbearing age, and they're in clinical. I don't know how many of you have done drug studies. What you will find is one of the issues you always have to look at carefully when you're doing a drug study, if you're doing it in men and women, and those women become pregnant. What happens if they become pregnant? And you always have to put qualifiers in your protocol and your consent to say, and often, because often we don't know the effect of that new drug on a person who's pregnant. So we have to address it in the protocol and consent that you have to take, what we do is you take a pregnancy test before you start the study. If you're pregnant, you can't do it. You have to use birth control, and then you can list the types of birth control. Abstinence is an acceptable one to use because you've educated the family or the woman on that she shouldn't get pregnant. We have studies where you just do the pregnancy test at the very beginning and then assume you're not going to be pregnant. We have others where every time they come in, you do a pregnancy test. I've been a part of some cancer studies where they get treated every 3 months. So you always check and make sure they're not pregnant before you give them the drug. Again, the nature of the dosing, the nature of the study will determine how frequently you might check to see if they're pregnant. Even if they claim they've been abstinent, even if they claim that they're using birth control, things happen, and we want to protect the fetus as much as we can and protect the pregnant woman. If she's on a drug and gets pregnant, maybe that will cause such an imbalance in her system that she would really have, very different side effects. Many women enter pregnancy with health problems, so doing research on them is very important. There's nobody saying it should be done. But we also need to we need to make sure that they're protected. Again, putting on our vulnerable population hat. What do we have to do to make sure she's as safe as possible? Studies directed toward the pregnancy, again, we're really looking to improve the health. One of the things we tend not to do, so I think what the point of this is, let's say we have an antibiotic and we're testing it. Will we include pregnant women in that study? Well, probably not, because really, unless that disease that we're studying is unique to pregnant women, there's no need to study it in pregnant women. I think one of the things we try to do, there's several reasons for doing studies on pregnant women. One, it will affect their health as the status of being pregnant. And then the second one is after we have a well-developed drug profile, we know how safe it is, then we might want to test it in women who are pregnant or might become pregnant to see if it will help them as well. But you want a really well-developed safety profile before you take any drug with a pregnant woman, again, unless they have a disease or a condition that's unique to their status. That's what the IRBs will look for. That's what the federal government looks for. Again, including pregnant women, is you want to minimize it as much as possible. Points to consider. Is there a reason to exclude pregnant or lactating women? We had a study where we were giving, for example, it was an antiviral drug to a child, and we did a newborn. We wanted to make sure the mother wasn't also taking that same drug, because then the child, and breastfeeding, because then the child would get twice the dose. So think about those things when you're writing your protocols as well. If you're giving a new drug, do you want, you want to make sure you exclude lactating women? You might, because you don't, if you're looking, especially if you're looking at PK/PDs, that was what we were actually studying. The pharmacokinetics of the drug, we wouldn't have that, not only could the child overdose, but we wouldn't have been able to really do a good PK/PD study. For all studies involving pregnant women, have animal studies and non-pregnant pregnant humans already been studied? Is there any special monitoring of the informed consent? What that means, you will see this often mentioned when we deal with vulnerable populations. Because of coercion, because we're really worried about that population, sometimes you have a witness. You have a really strongly documented witness present. I've not seen it with pregnant women, certainly when we get to prisoners and children, possibly, and there are some scenarios where it's good to have a witness when the children are being assented, but we'll get to that later. But again, think about that with your population. If it's a pregnant woman and she has an abusive husband, you don't know. You all have to use your judgment when we go through this. Again, studies directed toward the maternal health are the most important. And then, how does that impact the risk to the child? Will the mother get will be adequately informed of the potential risks to the fetus and the alternative treatments? Again, that's all part of the consent form. It's also true that in the consent form, one of the things that we are now trying to put is these are the risks for participating and these are the risks for not participating, or the risks for receiving a placebo. Again, that gives people the opportunity to make full, transparent decisions. Again, father's involvement, should he be included in the decision based on all the requirements that we discussed? Lactating women, again, this whole idea of requiring a contraceptive use. The next thing we're going to talk about is children. And this is probably the bulk of the presentation. It's kind of neat because we have spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to study children. Historically, as you all may know, when we would study a drug in adults, we based it on weight, So sure, we'll just change it, child's just a small adult, we'll give them a smaller amount. But we finally got smart and realized, well, it's really not true. The metabolism of a newborn, a 1-year-old, a 3-year-old is really quite different than an adult. And even up through the teens in various parameters. So it's important to do these research, to do the research in children. But we have a lot of protections we need to include. We were involved in a natural history study with children. One of the investigators was looking at families and children and families. And one of the steps or one of the arms of the study was to enroll children, to have them come in, be assented, have their mothers consenting. The mothers would consent, or actually give permission, and we'll come to that in a minute, and the child would assent, and we'll talk about that in a minute. We would draw blood, we'd send them home with this little kit so they could take it home, and then 2 weeks later they'd send us some poop. And so that was the study, that's all they got. And they did all of this, they got $50. We had a major influx of children coming in to be enrolled in the study just before school started. People needed money for school. The children told us that. We had one young man, probably 15, who said to us, the coordinator said to him, so what are you going to do with your $25? Because you got 25 when they come in and then 25 later. And he said, oh, it's not for me, it's for my mom. She's going to, we need it for bills. So here we have, it's a child, economically, challenged possibly. How do we deal with that? It was a very distressful situation because we felt the children were the ones who were supposed to be receiving at least some compensation for their discomfort. They're the ones who were having their arms stuck. Now, granted, the mother drove the car in; she would need money for gas. But what do we do in that scenario? So it makes children challenging when they decide to participate. Who's really giving consent? And we had one child who assented, and one parent did sign the permissions. When we went to draw the blood, the child refused and got very upset. And then the mother got very angry and started spanking him. And it was like, we just said, no, we're not drawing the blood. We just made the decision that we weren't, it wasn't that we were on the side of the child, but we assumed the child would then remove his or her assent for being in the study. It made us feel bad because we didn't know what happened after that child and mother left. Children are challenging to be consented, to consent in the study. Have any of you done studies with children? Have you had any challenging situations yet, or do you? No. Well, and it's one of those things that over time, when you do a variety of studies, you begin to see these things. So we, again, doing research in children. Again, we'll only do research if it's a reasonable opportunity to further the understanding, prevention, and remediation of serious problems affecting the health and welfare of children. We conduct in accordance with sound ethical principles and have adequate provisions for soliciting the assent of children and the permission of their parents. We have a tendency here. Yes, ma'am.
Just a quick question. So when children are involved in the study, as part of the consent process, do you take consent from the child? Not really, right?
No, not really. The way we in the U.S. look at it right now, you get, and again, you'll notice the word permission. We really get permission from the parent to bring the child into the study. And then the child, and I'll come back to this, I'll describe this a little bit further, then the child assents. They agree to the study. They can't consent fully because they're not of an age where they could give their full permission to be in the medical care. A young child cannot, fully consent to get medical care. They have to have someone else. Yes.
What's the legal definition of a child? Is it up until 18?
Well, yeah. In Alabama, you if you're 18, you can't be 17. 17 is the age of a child. No, excuse me. I'm thinking, get this, I'm going the wrong way. 19. Other states it's 18, some states it's 17. Now that's considered a child. However, for assent, usually that starts at age 5 or 6. A child of 5 or 6 might get assent. the IRB will help you determine that based on the nature of the study. A child under 5, it doesn't even give a cent. The parents really take that. It's waived for the child, is what we say.
But in our state, they can consent for medical treatment at age 16.
Yep.
500 rule to follow that we get actual consent from the child.
Yes. Yes, please, come in.
Hello? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But you're right. A number of years ago, we really struggled with the age of providing medical care. And then for a long time. And for different scenarios, the IRB will say, no, they still can't, given the nature, especially if it's a sexually transmitted disease. They're pretty good at the IRBs are waiving permission of the parent for children for that, for that condition. Other things, and the other irony is the age of majority. A person can be an adult when they have a child. That can happen at 14. So it becomes, but yet the parents, becoming that illegal on them being able to participate in research. Again, look at the nature of the child, the childhood, the age, the disease condition, and the protocol will help determine when a scent is necessary. Here are, I'm not going to read through all of this, there are very specific regulations about research involving not greater than minimal risk and consent. Again, greater than minimal risk, but with benefit to the child, research that involves greater than minimal risk but no benefit to the child. And then another category is research that would not be approved because it's not going to help the child at all, but it may help and alleviate a serious public health problem. Again, it's very specific regulations, and we'll talk a little bit about these. The key to these different regulations and these different categories of risk in research is that these will dictate who provides consent and which of the parents have to provide permissions and the child providing assent. So research on children and minors, these two regulations, research not, again, just kind of read more bulleted view, Section 404, not involving greater than minimal risk, and there's plenty, and there certainly is time the child can assent and permission of the parent or guardian. Again, the next section, the next category, and much more serious, would be involving greater than minimal risk, but presenting prospect for benefit to the child. Benefits must outweigh the risks, and then certainly provisions for consenting and assenting. This section, the third section is greater than minimal risk and no prospect for benefit. So, but it will help generalizable knowledge, and we clearly have studies like that. Last of all, this is one where we're just helping the public, and this one requires the Secretary of DHHS to agree to the study. So this one really gets bumped up. I've heard of this being used once, and it's probably been used more. I don't know that it's ever been used at UAB where we've had to go to the chair to get permission, but again, we really have written a lot of regulations to protect children. You know, it's 8:53. I think this may be, I think I'll stop right now and break, and then we'll come back and jump back. We got 5 to 10 minutes, I think.
Hello, just letting y'all know I'm here. I was a little bit late.
Excellent.
I mean, you have to have
Thank you, Jana, for letting us know. Well, that's a part.
Okay.
the only reason I emphasize those 4 categories is because each of them has the requirements of the parent. If there is. Well, yeah.
Hello. Yeah.
I think that's something that's
I just wanted to get my cell phone number and send me a text from her cell phone, so I'll say now that there's one. Hey, I got it, I'm okay with that. I've got an idea of the time.
but it's not, so there was some stuff that's not in the 1950s or something.
Okay. Yeah, keep the out the paperwork done, right from the board.
So, he's probably great.
Yes, I did. Will respond.
Well,
Thank you.
You know, and then one time, you know, one end is I mean, I don't want to see so I actually got some of the file that I've designed myself.
But that's no, I know. I will have it ready. No, I never did.
It's frustrating. So, I mean, I understand. You know, if you do the program, so years.
Yeah, but it doesn't.
And then I was going to make a part of it.
Y'all ready? Oh, okay.
I just want to make one announcement before we start. So just remind everybody that one of the features of this program is that each of you is offered a chance to sit in on an IRB session. Those happen on the Wednesdays when we meet. They start at 9 o'clock, so that if it's your week to do that, you'll just leave the class a couple minutes before 9, and the IRB meets in the AV building right across the street. So it's really convenient. There's a big group this year. My understanding is that one of the people in the group is actually on the IRB, so that there's actually 30 people who need to be accommodated. They can take 2 people per week doing this. So if we start the week after next, which is what Ms. Oliver, who is one of the coordinators of the IRB, requests, we will run through June 3rd to do that. Our plan is to have a sign-up sheet that will be available next week. And you'll so bring your calendar, know when you can't do it, and you'll just sign in. If there are people who get here too late and are only left options for dates that they can't participate, we'll try to help you swap out with somebody else, but we just encourage you to come on time and sign in and bring your calendar so you know what days you're available. Do you have any questions about that? I think it runs still around.
It runs 9:30 till noon.
Oh, it's 9:30. Okay, right. 9:30.
Wednesday. It's on Wednesday.
Okay.
And it's over in the administration.
It's just right across the street here. Thank you.
You're welcome. It is a wonderful experience, so please don't anybody miss going to the IRB. I think hearing how I have always been very impressed how thoroughly they review protocols and how they really think through them. I've always, again, had attended a few, and it's a really good experience. All right, so continuing with children, I'm going to give you some other situations that have come up. Because when we talk about assenting children, they're participating in the studies. We had a protocol that we actually have one going on now, where we're really enrolling women who come into the hospital with an intent to deliver, and we're really just getting a vaginal swab and a little blood. And what we're looking at, a natural history kind of study where we're trying to identify, we're working with a new device to see if it will better identify herpes simplex virus, so that we can identify, theoretically, if we could identify it before they deliver, we would know that we may need to do a cesarean section. Children who are born to mothers with HSV get the disease when they come to the birth canal. So that's kind of the premise. So we're trying to use this new device to see if we can better diagnose the mothers before delivery. The issue with this is we want to know if the child develops herpes. We're going to, in order to get the right data, we're testing our equipment, but we want to know if the child ends up with herpes. So we worked with the IRB where we will simply call the mother at a time point, I think it's like 2 months after delivery, and ask if the baby's healthy, if there are any symptoms of HSV. If we had looked at the medical record, if we had touched the baby, if we had asked for any more information about the child, we would have had to have gotten a waiver of assent, but it would have really complicated our protocol. Because then we would have been really studying 2 subjects. So right now, the way we designed it was to really minimize to almost nothing what we were asking for the child. And the IRB agreed that we're really just studying 1 subject, which is the mother. Again, the IRB helped us work through that to minimize the difficulty of consenting and obtaining data. So always with children, we want to keep everything at minimal risk. And just so you know, so when we talk about minimal risk to a child or anybody, it's what would happen in normal everyday life. It's what would happen if you present, again, no more than minimal risk would be what would happen when you go to the doctor, what happens when you walk down the street for a routine. But again, and if you're a very sick child, and this applies to adults as well, you're a cancer patient. What might be minimal risk to you is a lot different than a healthy human subject. Because if you think if you're a cancer patient and you're going through lots of treatments, your normal is pretty high, it's pretty intense. So we could define minimal risk, less than minimal risk differently for you than we would for someone who has absolutely no health condition whatsoever. Because they're not used to taking, if you have a brain tumor, you go in for an EEG periodically. The rest of us in this office, in this room, we don't have EEGs on a routine basis. So, yeah, just an important concept to understand. So as it says here, the assessment of the probability and magnitude of the risk may be different in sick children and with adults and in healthy children. It just depends on the disease. And when we look at benefits, the IRB will look really closely at this. And it's, again, it's a variable between the health status of the different subjects. A potential subject might be a normal, healthy child or a child, again, who's been exposed to a disease. So the benefits will be different. Again, you will need to understand that when you write your protocol and when you provide your information to the IRB. What is going to be the benefit to this child? A lot of times, and that's a very important section in your consent form, 99% of the time it seems to me we say that there may be no benefit. It may contribute to the generalizable knowledge. We have one study we're doing where they're giving, we're studying the PK, the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics of a drug that's been given to newborns for years, but nobody's ever studied the PK/PD. They know if they're giving the right dose. So we are enrolling subjects who are already getting the drug. So we're not increasing their risk. We're not giving them the drug. We're drawing PKs. That increases their risk a little bit. But we're going to probably draw it from a central line because they're all quite sick, hospitalized babies. So we won't be increasing that risk very much. A little bit. There'll be a little bit of risk by taking more blood. The benefit to the child is once we do these PK/PD studies, the data will be available to the clinician who might want to adjust the dose of the drug for the child. So we're able to say that could be a benefit from participating. But again, that doesn't always happen. A lot of times we're simply collecting data that we can put together in an aggregate manner to help change the standard of care. It's not going to affect that child because by the time we get to the end of the study, there is that child has long gone off to college probably. But anyhow, it's so the direct benefit to the child can be, as with adults in research, it's not it doesn't readily occur. Research on children and minors in phase 1 trials. Again, phase 1 trials are, yes ma'am.
I have a question. So the benefit should be to the child who is enrolled or to some other child in future? You know what I mean?
The benefit, what you can do studies if there's very little risk, if there's no benefit to the child directly.
To the child.
Right. You can still do research like that as long as you're not putting that child at any significant risk. I mean, the IRBs will let you do that, particularly.
Like, for example, you said the drug where you're studying PK and PKD, there it's not to the child, to that particular yeah, but it's to the person who might have been.
Well, what we did for this particular study, the child is, okay, they're receiving the drug for standard of care, and they're on this drug for 21 days. We do the PK/PD studies. We look at the, I hear where you're going. I need to explain the study a little better, I think. We usually do the PK/PD studies within the first week. We don't, you're right, we really don't know the full answer because we have to aggregate all the data to have a really good answer. But what we do provide to the clinician is the data that has been generated from other studies, and then the clinician can decide. For example, I'm not going to get this right, but I think the AUC for this drug is like 2,500 in adults, in teenagers. And there's literature about that. It's been studied. That's a good AUC for that drug. That's the level you want the drug to be at. So we just simply provide that to the clinician and say, okay, your child's AUC was 5,000, but the traditional AUC is, reported in other papers is 2,500. The clinician gets to make a decision. And the way, again, pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics is quite an interesting science, and no matter what the weight of the baby, no matter what the size of the person, the AUCs, the pharmacokinetics, are pretty good indicators of the right amount of drug. Meaning what we know from these other studies that when you have an AUC of 2,500, you're getting the right amount of drug. So again, we don't tell the clinician what to do, but we say, okay, here's your AUC, and this is what the literature says. And it gives them an opportunity to make a decision. It's clear, does that make sense? So that's where there might be some impact for that child. Are we changing this? We won't change the standard of care, though, until the end of the study when we can look at all children's and just confirm it. But I have really come to appreciate pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics. It's very, very complex and very focused. But that's another presentation that probably happens somewhere. Right, so in phase 1 studies, as you know, phase 1 studies are, the traditional definition is healthy human subjects, first time in humans. Great. We would probably never do that in children because we would not, we would more often than not do, it would be more like a cancer study. You think about cancer phase 1 studies, those are when we have a toxic drug, a drug we don't really understand well, but we're giving it to someone who has no other option. And we call it a phase 1 because it's first in humans. An antibiotic isn't necessarily going to save someone's life, so we probably test it in humans to make sure we get it right before we go to a sick person. But toxic drugs, you don't want to test your toxic drugs in healthy people. And the same would be, we don't, to test a very critical drug in a healthy child first time would be very dangerous. So again, we avoid healthy subjects in phase 1 for children. We would probably try to lean toward those that are have some illness.
What do you do in the case of early onset childhood disease, where you have no adult subjects?
Right, and that would be the population that you have no other option. It would be, you're right, that's a good point, because you would then test it in phase 1 in those children, probably, because you don't have the background information. It's a very good point. We are, one of the things that I do is I work with INDs, IDDs, and we help investigators put their packages together. There's an endocrinologist over children's who deals with type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes it usually occurs in young children. Sometimes they're 16 when they first get it. And then they have a lifetime of insulin. I mean, it's a very challenging, very hard to manage in children, as you can imagine. Trying to keep children on a strict diet is not anything any parent ever wants to do because of compliance, as you can imagine. So the research has not progressed for how to treat type 1 diabetes in children. There's been some evidence that there are GABA, I think it is, it's a food additive, has shown that it heals the islet cells of the pancreas, and that's where insulin is made, and that's what happens. When you get type 1 diabetes, you don't produce enough insulin. So, again, it's sort of, the story is if you give this GABA drug early in the diagnosis of diabetes, the children will fare much better, less dependence on insulin. He wanted to study this, so we had to go to the FDA to get an IND approval, because it's a food additive, but you still have to go to the FDA. The challenge we had was the FDA had a really hard time understanding why we couldn't test this in adults first. Well, adults don't have type 1 diabetes, and when they do, it's not identified for years usually, and therefore it took a lot of arguing with the FDA to say, we want to do this in children because that's the only population that it can be studied in. We had animal studies, so that's kind of a scenario where not only do you have to work with your IRB, but the FDA. They will not allow you to go forward with children if there's anything. They did get it approved, and again, I think they've started enrolling. It would be quite a nice thing if a food additive helped type 1 diabetes, because the risk is almost, All right, so now we're going to talk about consent. This was a question that came up, consent and assent. Again, regulations require assent of the child or the minor with the permission of the parents. And as I said before, we used to call it, and we still, if you go talk to our IRB, usually it's called a consent form, but it's really a permission form for the parent. When is it necessary? When is assent necessary? Again, it's based on some of the things we talked about earlier. The IRB will make that judgment call with your input for the age, maturity, psychological status of the child. That's what we do. Then we use that data to then determine what is the age of assent. It might be 5 years old, depending on the study. It may be 8 years old. I think for the study that we were doing in the ER, we were doing outpatient where we were just drawing blood and poop later on. 5-year-olds could consent to that because we were drawing blood. I mean, it wasn't anything. There was nothing more complicated than that. The risk for them was having their needles stuck in there. So what it's usually, it's like a very short form that just talks about in very, very simple language. That's what an assent form is, what will happen to them. It really has basically all the same criteria as a consent form, probably with a few sections omitted. The IRB has templates, just so everybody knows. If you need a consent form or an assent form, you go to the IRB. So, again, when is it not necessary? The IRB may determine, because the children simply can't consult, so they won't require an assent form. If you're doing a study, if you have a child with cancer, depending on the age, it may be that the IRB determines that this will really help that child. There's just no way it won't. At least they believe that to be true. And that there's great prospect of helping the child, but they may waive the assent of the child, and they just put the full burden on the parent. Again, every case is different. It's been in the news recently about a number of teenagers who are refusing chemotherapy, and they're not adults yet, but should they be allowed to refuse? And again, would it be per child too? If you have a really mature child, should they be allowed? Well, I think it's a very difficult question, and I don't really have an answer for that. kids would just say, I'll be grateful we don't have to deal with that, I hope. But again, it's a possibility when you're designing studies, especially with teenagers. So again, the IRB also determines the capability of assent based on minimal risk, and they might waive assent if it's not practical. And as long as they'll look at the rights of the child and make sure they can waive those or that they're not waived. And they have pertinent information will be provided after the research. Again, following through, the IRB again is going to be making that determination for you or helping you with it. Again, as I keep saying that, but the IRB is going to expect you, when you submit your application, to have an idea of these things. They'll help you fine-tune it, but you still need to know. Again, this is sort of a repeat. One of the things that the IRB might require, depending on the nature of the study, is they might require an IRB member be present when the child is consented, or when the child is assented and the parent permission is given. Again, I haven't seen that happen, but in the regulations, it certainly is a possibility. I think I could see it happening when it's an important study and there's concern about coercion for the child. So,
Question about coercion.
Yeah.
So coercion can come from a parent as well, correct?
Yes, it can.
So how does the IRB handle that kind of coercion? Or is that the investigator's job?
Well, and the thing is, the investigator's the first line there, and or his team. Certainly, it's forbidden. We're just, and that is the real. I mean, that sort of is kind of what this question is: who prevails? What if the parent says they're trying to coerce their child? The parent wants them to participate, and the child doesn't. Who wins? And how do you decide that? It's very hard. I think that's where the IRB comes in to a degree, and where if they waive assent, then the IRB has said this is an important enough study for this child that it doesn't matter what the child thinks. We believe with the PI that the child needs to be in the study, that there is benefit. There's truly, I think if the IRB says this child should be allowed to assent, then I think if the child says no, then that's it. The other issue, and I think it's on the next slide, is what about the order of consent? And the IRB may ask you about that. Do you consent the parent first and then the child, or the child and then the parent? Again, something to think about. It may be dependent on your study. You consent them together. So really, what do you all think if the child refuses to assent? Would you agree that they shouldn't participate? And if any of you have children, think about that. Think about it from that perspective, because that makes it a little harder. As a clinician, you think one way. I think as a researcher, you say, well, of course, if the child says no, then we're not going to let them participate.
It depends on the age of the child. I mean, 6-year-old versus a 13-year-old.
Right.
Depending on the study too, for exactly what it is. If it's for a blood draw, just for the general knowledge, that might not be as serious as maybe you should try this new chemotherapy, everybody. It's going to help you, kind of thing.
Yeah. Consent procedures. The IRB will ask how you're going to do all of this. As I said, the children should be asked if it's determined by the IRB that they are not going to waive assent. Again, I think it's just such a gray area that it becomes challenging, and these are just issues that you all need to be thinking about if you do involve children in the research. Again, I talked earlier about the order in which children are consented, and parents or guardians give permission. There is not a specific order, but it really depends on how you describe. Because in your IRB application, you have to describe how you're going to obtain consent. If you're assenting and consenting a child, the IRB will ask you, okay, how are you going to do this? And they really want to know the specifics. One could argue that if you talk to the parent first, maybe you're being more they're going to put pressure on their child. If you talk to the child first and they refuse, you don't even talk to the parent. That would be what you would do. That would be maybe one way of getting a full and clear disclosure from information from the child without coercion. But that's just, I'm just speculating. So this came up earlier. So when do you know, we talked about the fetus and you need both the parents, the father and the mother to consent. When can you just have one parent? When the research is no greater than minimal risk, or when there is no greater than minimal risk and the prospect of providing benefit to the individual. Pretty straightforward. One parent. Because if you think about it, these two are probably the lowest risk. Because and again, if you think about risk and benefit, you're minimizing your risk by increasing the benefit. So one parent, both parents. If it's greater than minimal risk and no prospect of providing benefit, and if it's the other second bullet point, if it's really not going to provide any benefit at all, then it's just not benefit. So again, we're looking at studies that have theoretically greater risk for the child, therefore you really need both parents involved. I will tell you, most of the time, when the IRB puts together consent forms, there are two spaces for both parents. And sometimes they'll have one parent, a line for one parent's signature, and the other line that maybe says optional. Because I think depending on the family, you may still want both parents to sign, but it may not be required to have them do that. So, again, we talked about this earlier. When is parental consent not appropriate? And with sexually transmitted diseases, this has become a big issue. HIV, it's become a big issue, especially for teenagers, 16-year-olds, 15-year-olds. Can they participate in research and not with their parent consent? The IRB will help you decide that. But if it's a very low-risk study, it probably would get by not requiring parents. What if the parents don't have enough knowledge and understanding? Yes, sir.
So is there any kind of decision competency testing? So we have similar kinds of issues with like mental retardation and that type of thing, like especially with genetic type of Down syndrome, for example. So it seems like there ought to be some kind of competency testing.
Right.
Decision. Is that
it's not done routinely. I have heard of that. I've heard of again, especially when you do vulnerable populations cognitively. Do you do an assessment first? Do you give them a questionnaire? There's not routine, but it's a wonderful suggestion, and I imagine it has been done. And what if again, a critically ill child and the parents aren't cognitively competent? Then what do you do? In that situation, you'd probably find a legal guardian. I think it would be, I've not seen this happen, but I just don't see, especially if it's a new drug that's maybe toxic, the parents aren't competent, you find someone who is competent to oversee and consent for the parent. So again, more just guidelines and regulations. The important thing to note is wards of the state. We have had children in studies that suddenly are taken from their parents and they're made wards of the state. Well, can they continue on in a clinical study? Only if they become the legal authorized representative. And if you usually have to go to the court and get documentation that this new person can actually provide authority for the child to be in this study.
Do they have to be consent?
Sometimes. Depending on the nature of the relationship, but we probably would do that just to make sure that everybody's on board, because they can't, you certainly can, I probably would do that.
I have questions. So do you need to inform health insurance companies before participating in clinical trials?
Do we? No.
Don't have to?
No. That's an evolving issue too, because I would say 10 years, maybe 15 years ago, there was a point where insurance companies, if they knew, there were some companies, but if they knew you were participating in a research study, they would cut off your health insurance. They would make you go to get another policy. I think insurance companies have been forced into a situation where they really can't do that anymore. I think we are trying to control that kind of behavior. I'm not sure it's completely controlled. I know that you just don't hear about it as much, and I know that it made a lot of problems. I mean, it's really, because then people don't want to participate. They weren't participating because they might lose their health insurance. There was a period of time where we didn't put any information about research in the medical record, kind of for that reason. Now we have to put the consent form in the medical record, the signed consent form, which means that if an audit was done by the insurance companies, which they're allowed to do, they would identify it. So there had to become a time, there had to be a way to get away from that because it was starting to hurt us a lot. But you don't have to know that. Oops. So the key thing about children, again, they're a vulnerable population. The local IRB will help you determine the level of risk and the subject maturation to determine assent. Again, as everything in research, it's risk and benefit based. Specific challenges, as we've described. You know, if you do a multi-center study, every IRB may look at it differently, whether the child needs assent or not. We do multi-center studies, and UAB has the parent, even for newborns, the UAB has the parent sign a waiver of assent for the child. We have other hospitals who say, if the child is 1 month old, we're not even including that in our consent form. Every IRB interprets this a bit differently. Assessing the ability to assent is not clearly defined. That is a big challenge. It's a perpetual one. The definitions for the ethical and practical conditions for valid assent are missing, and there's no guidance for the role that the children who are determined to be incapable of providing assent might play in decisions about research participation. A lot of gray areas, but truly a lot of research is beginning to grow in the pediatric setting because we're getting more aware of and we're more sensitive to the fact that we have not done a good job of determining doses for children. That we really have been very careless and just use weight-based from adults as opposed to the metabolism of the child, which requires studies in children. Things to consider. Again, I don't think I'll read through all of these. You'll have them in your handout, but they're the things we've talked about. Things to consider when you're doing a study with children and considering their consent. Cognitively impaired participants. You know, there is not a section in the regulations about how to deal with the elderly, but kind of, as we get older, because our memories get a little sketchy, we fit into this category a little bit. Again, not extensively, but it does happen. I don't know with our aging population if more codes will be written just to deal with us, but hopefully not. Primary ethical concerns, again, anybody who has cognitive impairment, and it kind of goes back to what you were saying, that, you know, could we have a test? Could we have a means to determine? I mean, how do you know if somebody's cognitively impaired? You don't always know that when they come in to meet with you the first time. We have had people in studies who it really was like 3 months into the study and we realized there was something wrong. But then we go, again, there was no measure. But there are people that you know. A lot of, and again, one of the things this addresses is cognitively impaired and people who are institutionalized. People in an institution are more, could be perceived to be either terribly afraid of you and they never participate because they've been in this altered environment, or they become so complacent, they become so, yes, I'll do what I'm told to do. Their days are structured. They have people caring for them all the time, so they feel more indebted to the people around them. They're more likely, I mean, one could argue that they're likely to say yes to anything you ask them because they're conditioned to do that, just by the nature of an institution. And for that reason, again, their volunteering, their ability to volunteer in the manner in which we expect is not quite the same. It's sort of impaired. Again, what the IRB would do, again, they would have somebody on their board who has, and if you're doing a study specifically with people who are cognitively impaired, the IRB would have someone on the board to review them. And one of the things, and this is overriding for all of the different populations, is that when you do research with these, focused on these populations, be sure you have to use them. Example, would we need to do a study on flu with cognitively impaired people? We really wouldn't. There is no indication that they're any different than you or I. And because of the difficulty in consenting them and making sure they understand the study, it's okay not to include them in the research. Now, if there's something, in there, if they have Alzheimer's, I mean, maybe somebody determines that with Alzheimer's, you don't get the flu as much. And so then it may be, or whatever, we need to do studies in them about the flu. But it's because there's something unique to their population. So again, because of the challenges and the lack of benefit, really, of including these populations, it's okay not to include them and only to do it when you need to. Again, as I mentioned earlier, those who are institutionalized, it becomes quite challenging. Their ability to cooperate is probably either great. They're either really cooperative or they're really not cooperative. And again, that may not always be the case, and I'm making some generalizations, but you have to be extremely cautious. Again, they're just quite vulnerable, and their world is different than ours. Their decision making is not exactly the same as what we are able to do. So for them to voluntarily participate is challenging. One of the things that has been known in the past, has been done in the past, is that there has been research in mental institutions because they're a convenient sample. I don't know if you've heard that word, but they're easy to get to. They're there. They're going to be there 6 months when you come back. They're going to be there next week. You just show up and they're there. How convenient that would be if we could do research all the time with those populations. But not really, because it's not right. But again, historically, if you look back in the history of research, there have been times when we have done significant research on these convenient populations. And it's truly something we need to avoid for that. You just don't do research. And if you don't identify it, the IRB will identify it when you submit it. So, again, if you do cognitively impaired subjects, you have to, again, address the risks, and you need to minimize. You need to understand so one of the things I think here's kind of a comment that kind of fits with one made just a short while ago. Again, screening criteria to make sure that the subjects are able to be in the study. We want to, again, consult with healthcare providers with this population to make sure that we understand the study population. Again, these would all be characteristics of any good protocol. A lot of times, too, that those who are hospitalized or in institutions are separated from their family. So it's just a different population, things that you have to remember when you're bringing them into the study. As I've said, presumed competent to consent unless there is evidence of serious mental disability. That's what we normally do with adults. But then there are these subtle issues that we can't identify. So a test would be really wonderful if we could come up with some kind of measures. I'm sure there are some out there. I don't know, again, as I said, I don't know how frequently they're used. Persons who are noted to be incompetent must have a court-appointed guardian. And that's one thing I warn you about is if you're doing research and you need to have a legally authorized representative to provide consent or permission for this person to participate. It shouldn't be just a relative, because relatives kind of come and go, and you don't know, who really has authority over that person, and can provide, and has that person's best interest at heart. Again, continued with problems of consent and competency. Sometimes they're incompetent and they have no legal guardian. That is a really big challenge. again, I've known family members who can argue both ways. And you have a person, we've had people who wanted to enroll, there's not been a legally authorized representative around. We do avoid just asking the next of kin for consent. If we do, we get thorough support from the IRB, depending on the nature of the study. We did we did a study in the ED where we had to enroll people in the study who came in with head trauma. Now let's see, they can't consent very well for themselves. But there was a point where we did it two ways. One, we got total waiver of consent from the IRB until that person was conscious. Because they were, so that was acceptable. The other was we were permitted to have the wife or the next of kin who came in with that person give consent. That to me is more precarious. I'd almost rather not get consent from anyone and just wait till the person is cognizant with IRB support, of course. Just sort of continues on with the same theme that we've been talking about. Again, we just want to provide as much support to the patients as we can to make sure that they thoroughly understand what they're participating in. And to know that they are, many people have started, and this is a practice that I've seen, a questionnaire is used at the end of the consent process, where you have maybe one page, maybe 10 questions that are the key points of your consent, and they're yes or no answers, and you certainly mix them up. And this way, after you've provided the consent, if they can reiterate to you on paper, or if you have to read it to them, but you get those answers to those questions to know if you provided adequate consent. That would be one way of determining, after the consent process, if that person might be capable of understanding.
I have a question about neurodegenerative diseases and patients who come in there. Would you need a court-appointed guardian, or is a spouse who's maybe the primary caregiver for that person acceptable?
We always put in our consents a legally authorized representative because you just don't know about a spouse. But again, what you will do is tell the IRB, it legally depends on the nature of the study, what you want to do, that you're going to use legally authorized for a spouse.
This is a question about US law because I'm not from here. We have a thing called the power of attorney, and most people in that situation would nominate usually a spouse to be the power of attorney. Is that the case as well?
Similar.
Right.
But yeah, I think power of attorney is, usually we do power of attorney when, again, David helped me with this because I haven't done it, but it seems to me power of attorney is often used when a person is totally incapable of making any decisions, and you get power of attorney to make all the decisions for them. And so, again, maybe not much different than legally authorized representative. I don't really know the differences.
I know it varies a lot from state to state, too, and some states have persons who are assigned to be a healthcare proxy, basically, but not have other powers. And
we do let next of kin make decisions in end-of-life care in the ICU setting, even if there's nothing binding, there's nothing on paper. So we do let those decisions be made in ICU. So we can take that without that.
But with that, is it true? I'm glad you brought that up. This is about research now. Is it true that either all the families have to agree, all family members have to agree, or do you just take the mother or the father or the,
If there's a spouse, I think the spouse comes first, and then the living older child, and then parents. But we do, if one person agrees and that person is truly next of kin, that's all we do to make that decision.
I'm just curious if that actually holds if there's conflict among the family, or does
It
can be messy.
It can be messy. Now, there's only one person in the ICU says this is what needs to be done, and nobody else shows up. We go forward with that. But yeah, if there's 10 people in the room, and that can be an ethical problem where you bring in other people.
All right, so these are just points to consider. We talked about most of them, but again, a point of reference for you all. So at the end of the handout. Research with prisoners. I do think that one of the blackest marks on research is that we have, at different times, used, even in the past, in the 40s, we were using prisoners to study malaria, I think it was, or yellow fever. I can't remember which. But U.S. was doing that because we had everybody in the South Pacific, so we were trying to understand how to treat the disease, and we went to our prisons and injected people with the disease. So that is not so long ago. But again, we were using this wonderful convenience population, a mixture of people who could participate in our research, and that's we weren't the only ones in the world to do it, but we certainly aren't innocent of protecting their rights. Again, laws are in place now. You can't use prisoners without the same principles that we talked about earlier, and it would be you can't do research on prisoners unless it's unique to the prisoner. It has to almost have something to do with incarceration. You know, that is really, again, it's sort of like studying, when we talked earlier about children, you know, or pregnant women. If it's important to that population, then you can do the studies in them, you know, with them. But if not, you use another population. Don't use the convenient prison population. Their biggest challenge, again, very similar to the cognitively impaired and the institutionalized, is the autonomy. How can they, they're in prison, giving them a few dollars, there's coercion is so easy, vulnerability is pretty high, they're in a research study, they may be singled out. A lot of issues are really focused on including prisoners in studies.
Even if you get their consent, still you cannot use it?
No, you can. It's just making sure you have all the checks and balances in place. You know, you need to, again, making sure that you do need to do the research in that population, that it's going to benefit the population, and not just the general public. That you have put in place all the possible confidentiality issues, and you've addressed everything that might need to protect them. You know, you don't want them to be singled out or vulnerable. You can pay them, but apparently, and I hadn't realized this, they often, prisoners don't get much money. And if you give them $10, it's a lot. And so it can be coercive. I mean, what would be $10 in prison is a whole lot different than $10 on the street. So again, you have to balance all of that. What's normal to that population?
Same thing applies to the homeless people also.
It does. It does. Yes. And that's quite challenging because a lot of times if you don't know that they're homeless, and that's why we get our research subjects who keep coming through the door. But it is. It's definitely a coercion. One of the key things that the IRB considers is they will have somebody, again, this just sort of addresses what I said about the disease focused on that population. The IRB board must have someone represent the prisons on the board when they approve such a program. Again, goes with every other vulnerable population, is having the adequate representation on the board to address possible questions and concerns and look clearly at the vulnerable population. Again, a laundry list of things that DHHS looks for when involving prisoners in research. No more than minimal risk or inconvenience. But then we can do no more than minimal, again, it's all within the institutional structure, and you just want to protect the subjects as best you can. But it really just depends on the design of the study, whether it can be approved or not. And just know what you're trying to pull together. Also, the Federal Bureau of Prisons is quite involved in research, and they always will want to be aware of research that's being done in their prisons, so their involvement is critical. So you have a lot of people you have to address.
But isn't that dangerous? You know, you see those movies where they all the time try to escape when they go to the doctor. I mean, they put the nurses and everybody, medical team, at risk there for their lives.
I think TV exaggerates a bit.
Okay.
I think
Hey, good to know.
It would be in a protected environment.
Okay.
So again, key points to remember. the hardest part for this population is coercion, undue influence, duress. It's a unique population, and anything we do could impact how their stay is or how their condition continues to be perceived. Again, the most important thing for you all to take away, I know it's a lot of information, a lot of it's vague, but you've got to understand dealing with vulnerable populations is vague. It's unique. It's something you just need to be very sensitive to, whether you want to include them, whether you don't want to include them, what are the risks, what are the benefits to including them, what are the challenges, and as you design your protocols, as you prepare your consent forms. Again, you need to just include them if it's necessary. You don't want to exclude people who might benefit from studies we're doing, but you have to have the justification. I think the last item is the most important. Just know or become familiar with the federal laws, state laws, and local laws. I'll go back, and the core IRB is probably cringing as I keep saying this, but they will be your strongest guide in whether you're doing it right or not. So you're just not in it alone, but raising the questions. Does anyone have any questions?
So considering all populations, including vulnerable and normal and so on, is there any surprises, say deviations from common sense regarding non-compliance issues and failure to complete study issues? Are there any particular groups that seem to be much worse? I mean, that you may not expect.
Right. So the question is, of all our vulnerable populations, is there all populations? Is there a group that probably deviates from studies more than has more protocol deviations than any other group? That's kind of the, or which is the most difficult population to deal with of that? What do you all think? I sometimes think children aren't that hard because they've got their parents coercing. I mean, I'm just using the word because it's what happens in subtle ways. Prisoners are probably not.
I like healthy volunteers the most difficult because there's really no benefit and they don't, well, there's like direct benefit to them. So often they make an appointment, they have no, oh, I'll try to call back and make an appointment again, and they don't realize it. But if you're not well or sick or something, they're more willing to come in because they think that they can kind of understand a benefit to them for themselves, right? Right. At least personally.
So yes, that's probably true. If it's just a healthy population, they may be the worst. That's a good point.
So one of the treatment groups it would seem by common sense that those that have more serious illness would be more compliant. Yeah. Is that always true?
I think it's true, and an indication of that is that we compensate patients for coming to the hospital. Patients who are in cancer studies rarely get compensated. They don't need to. Their compensation is living. So that's kind of the extreme, but that's really, you're right. They're probably the most compliant anyway.
We found that in pain research. We're trying to recruit someone who's, let's say, just had an injury, and we're looking at acute recovery. If it's an injury where 90% of people get better, it's really hard to get them in the study. If we look at chronic pain, and people have really been suffering and really had a hard life, it's actually pretty easy to get them in the study. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What I was going to ask is one of the vulnerable populations you didn't mention has also been subjected to some questionable medical practices in the military. And particularly when you said that, when you look at conditions that are not kind of idiosyncratic to the population, let's say TBI, where you might have to look at them because your funding comes from the DoD, that's not necessarily what you're looking at other people. Right. How's that addressed? How's the military looked at generally? Are there special considerations?
If you're doing a study with the military, I think there are certainly, why in the back of my mind do I think there are certain things you have to work with the Department of Defense on to make sure that you've covered all of their issues.
From like the IRB perspective, because we do work in GWI and stuff like that. So we do a bit of DoD.
Yes.
I'm just wondering from the IRB perspective, whether there's anything.
That's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head. I would imagine that it would be a vulnerable population because they clearly are, and I'm just going to use the word conditioned to follow orders, to do what they're told to do. I bet they'd be really compliant.
Oh, they're fantastic participants.
But the vulnerability, coercion would be a big thing.
whole studies done through VA hospitals,
Yes.
which I don't know, I know that you have to, like when you report on it, you have to write that this is done in the whole VA population, but I'm sure the results are kind of, they're different. They're usually mostly, well, we've always seen them, at least for cardiac disease or heart disease, it's always a bunch of men. There's like 2% women.
Right.
So the results are very skewed toward one subpopulation, and it's whenever they report on the work that we read, it's always, this is the population we looked at, and this was where we were able to recruit from.
But there's a separate group for the VA, and you generally can't do a study that involves both VA subjects and non-VA subjects in the same study, as far as I know. In most cases, it's very hard to get that.
You have two
done.
separate,
You have to have two separate studies. And it would be interesting to sort of have the representatives of both systems available to talk in the same session sometime. But do you know, are there any studies that address people who have completed research and identified settings in which they really regret that they participated, and what the situations are that lead to people having a bad experience in the research protocol?
Not, that would be a really fantastic paper, study. I don't think globally. I think sometimes in a research study, they may go back and say, well, what was your experience like since, and why did you drop out? I mean, I do see that people collect that data, but I don't know of any off the top of my head. But very interesting and important question. It would help us with our designing studies and conducting them. Any other questions?
Thanks
Thank
very
you
much.
all.
Okay.
See you later.
In my life, so
Good question. Mostly somebody
electronic data.
That's right.
In their practice to see if they can find some associations.
Right.
Degree of severity.
That's okay. Interesting.
They did not win.
For the pharmaceutical. Right.
We've done those, and it really,
Yeah.
and it's exempt, and then you go to consent, and you just, yeah, I mean.
Very nice place.
Although I haven't did
It's
this
necessary before you would.
for 10 years now.
So do they have to be careful
Yeah.
whether to admit that
Sort of used
they're
to, you know,
allowed to look, or do they just?
Get the permission and then finish up, and,
Okay, well, okay.
because
Most of them
there's
live
also
around
we
the
publish on it.
field
That's what it would want to go.
area.
Sometimes people do that for QC, just to QC
St.
themselves,
Kilda,
and that's
L,
what
that kind of region there. So we would.
Yeah, the privilege is internal, assessing, but if it's important enough for you to keep things that would be interesting.
Well, it's going to be a student
Oh, I think we would.
Yeah.
presented as a poster.
Oh, that'd
Yeah.
be great, yeah, this should be by your picture. It even could be just taking a database, I mean, then that, so it can already be done.
My coffee. Do I need anything special for my
I'll
or is this
do
a perfectly chosen color that it doesn't show when it dries?
No, it definitely,
I'm sorry.
it shows, but I'll get it.
So David, you need to let me know if I was on target. I'm also thinking maybe more interactive. Now that I know.
I actually was, as you were going through, I was thinking that there would be the potential to break up into small groups, have a discussion of some issue, and then talk about it. It would, take away some of the discussion you could do, but
Right.
it would open up
But it
some
might be,
possibility for
right,
people to
to
think
analyze
about
it.
it. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think my only, we do quite a bit of, get a lot of feedback, so we can, if there are particular things you'd like us to ask about, we don't always think of the right things, but, so we can run the survey by you before we
All
send
right,
it.
yeah, I think
I think my only question would be whether there was a lot of discussion of children, particularly in whether that was right for this department. I think it was. I mean, I think people come from us pretty different areas.
Yeah.
We're all thinking about different things, but I kind of feel questions about it. Whether it should, at least half the people are really engaged and thinking about it. So I think it's great. And one thing that we're still trying to figure out, so I didn't actually get to hear what Carrie Allen was talking about last year when she talked about the IRB. I'm pretty sure it's much more nuts and bolts about what the groups and what those but we'll send them, if you don't mind, their presentation for her to look at before she's going to do next week and make sure she
Yeah.
doesn't have a lot of overlap.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Katie.
Did you feel like it was on target for the group? Okay.
I think it was pretty good.
There's a lot of her slides she had too many slides that had too many words that she didn't intend for anybody to read. So
yeah.
I think I don't know how to advise her.
Well, I think most of her stuff was, this is good information for you to have at a later date.
Right.
So, that's.
She recognized that there would be a pretty good opportunity to have some sort of breakout into little groups to discuss things in a group for 15 minutes and then talk about it a little bit, because this is the kind of stuff that lends itself to discussion. It's a little trickier with a group of people like this that don't know each other to get the ice broken in a short amount of time. But because there clearly were people who have thought about different aspects of this quite a lot, and others who haven't delivered.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
Sorry, I should never.
No, if I get it quick, it doesn't stain. And usually when we come in after somebody's rented the place and they built and they haven't done anything, then
So I won't do anything here because
I think we can, we can stop recording. Yeah.